Strike three. Umpire Billy Golden announced loudly as he ended the top half of the third inning at Small Admiral Fetterman Field in Pensacola, Florida, home of the Pensacola Blue Wahoos, the Double-A affiliate of the Miami Marlins. As directed, Scout Sam Casper took his usual seat on the Admiral to check on the progress of the Marlins' #1 overall draft pick of 2 years ago, Davy Golden Eagle Boyd. It was his second trip to Pensacola this season. The big club seemed to be hoping that last year's rookie would rise to the show by September, and they trusted the judgment of no one more than Casper, who had been scouting for them for 18 years. Boyd, who has a solid .286 batting average with 12 home runs and 36 runs batted in through mid-June, has so far justified the $1.75 million bonus the Marlins paid him when he signed last year. Casper thought the 6'4", 240-pound 24-year-old could hit for both average and power, play as first base and run like the wind, Casper mused, making him perhaps one notch below Mike's potential Trout of the Angels, considered by most to be the greatest player in the game. Boyd exuded confidence as he strode to the plate as Pensacola's third-inning baseman. His long, wavy blonde hair peeked out from under his baseball helmet. His large biceps and triceps filled the short sleeves of his uniform. Almost all the women in the small stadium sat up straighter and paid more attention to the baseball player. Home attendance has increased this year, especially among women. Casper had a notepad and pen in his hands to record the progress of the game and his observations of it. He may have been the only man in the stadium who paid more attention to the baseball player than the women. With the bases empty and one out, Boyd tied the game and then sent a 96 mph ball over the wall in left field. The stadium erupted with applause. Casper took notes feverishly, smiling from ear to ear. It was on his recommendation that the Marlins selected Boyd with their first pick. Boyd added another run later in the game as the Blue Wahoos won 4-2. Casper wrote a few more notes in his notebook and then headed to the Wahoo locker room to talk to Boyd and the Wahoo manager. Alyssa Graber and Tracy Strickland sat at a corner table at La Scala, a luxury restaurant, each eating a slice of cheesecake and drinking a glass of Galliano. Both women were in their 30s, well-dressed, and seemed quite at home in their surroundings. Davy Boyd and Arturo Gonzalez looked out of place as soon as they entered. They had come to the restaurant to celebrate their victory the day before and were shown to a table in the middle of the restaurant. "Oh, I'll take that blonde guy over there," Tracy said, pointing at Davy. Alyssa followed Tracy's gaze to the pair of baseball players. "Oh, please. These two probably haven't read a book since Sally, Dick, and Jane. $10 says they'll both order burgers," Alyssa said. "Agreed. Do you know them?" Tracy asked. "All I know is that they're two members of the local baseball team. Your fantasy boy there is their star rookie, signed a big contract." Handsome and rich. Always a nice combination," Tracy said, slowly breaking into a smile as the pair of jocks looked at the women. "Does it bother you that they're probably young enough to be our little brothers?" asked Alyssa. "I don't want to buy one, just rent one," Tracy said, flashing her perfectly white teeth at the players. "Look at this," Davy exclaimed, turning to Arturo. "A couple of beauties just waiting for company." Davy, as a player with a big contract and bonus, usually paid, as he usually did when he went out with his teammates. He called the waitress and asked her to take 2 drinks to the women at the corner table. "Did you know that both of these women are married, and the one with the short hair is the wife of Mayor Richard Strickland?" asked the waitress. "That's normal," Davy replied. "I just want to buy them a drink, not rent them for the evening." The waitress smiled and did as she was told. The players watched as the waitress delivered the drinks, then raised their drinks towards the women. The women responded in kind. The players ate their burgers while watching the women talk. "Damn, boy. Have you won over that cute little blonde yet?" asked Arturo. "What's the point, Artie? We're having fun, but we're not married. Besides, there's nothing better than a married woman." "I didn't know you had a degree in women's studies. My hat goes to you, Professor." Both baseball players loft. Alyssa was a banker's wife. She was 36 years old, had long blonde hair, a beautiful face with blue eyes and a curvy body. Her friend at the table was 35 years old, with shoulder-length dark brown hair, small breasts, but a round ass under her slightly too tight and short skirt. The mayor's wife knew that she still had something that could attract a man's attention, and was not as shy in showing it off as the mayor would have liked. "By the way, you owe me $10, Alyssa noted. The players finished their burgers before approaching the table of women. "Would you like some company for a while?" asked Davy. "Who do you have in mind for us?" Tracy replied sarcastically. Davy only thought about the answer for a short time. He was a seasoned professional in dealing with women and regarded Tracy's response as the first shot. He decided that Arturo could take care of the quieter one. "Well, since you have such a sharp tongue, I thought of myself. Arturo is more of a gentleman here. I think he would be good company for your girlfriend. By the way, I'm Davy. Arturo and I play for the Blue Wahoos, the city's AA baseball team. I'm Tracy and my friend is Alyssa. I think we can talk about interesting topics for a while, if you can handle it." "Arturo looks like he can handle it. Maybe he can make up for both of you." "Wow." "Oh," Davy said. The four spent time together over their second drink and for about 2 hours. Before they parted ways, Davy asked for and received Tracy's phone number. "Did you really just give him your number?" Alyssa was perplexed. "Do you remember that you are married?" "A little flirting, maybe a little more. Never hurt anyone. I can see he's a player. I'll just play with him a little," Tracy laughed. "If only you knew what you were doing," Alyssa commented. Walking off in a different direction, Arturo asked Davy, "Are you giving up on Blonde?" "What made you think I'd do something stupid?" Davy answered. "It's not like Blondie and Tracy are in the same social circle." "If only you knew what you were doing," Arturo said. Blonda, as two Wahoo players called her, was actually a 20-year-old Pensacola native named Jenna Wyatt. She showed up at the team's locker room after the season opener, and she and Davy have been together ever since. Over the past month, the couple had sex 2 to 3 times a week. Jenna was not a naive girl from the city. Although she had only graduated high school 2 years ago, her number was already in double digits. She was a young woman with a large sexual appetite and was not shy about getting what she wanted. Currently, she wants to be the star of the city's baseball team. The day after the game, Jenna was waiting for Davy, wearing a tight black short-sleeve blouse and tight skinny jeans that showed off her firm butt, Davy thought when he saw Jenna. They left the park and went to the house Davy had rented, stopping for pizza along the way. After eating pizza and drinking a couple of beers, Davy and Jenna retired to the master bedroom and king-size bed. Halfway to the bed, Davy looked deeply into Jenna's hazel eyes and kissed her passionately. Jenna's knees buckled before Davy laid her on her back on the bed. When his breathing returned to normal, Davy grabbed a towel from the bathroom and went to the kitchen for 2 more beers. They took their time drinking the cold liquid and then returned to bed for a second round. Tracy didn't recognize the phone number that appeared on her display at first. Then she remembered that she had given her number to this young baseball player 4 days ago. She laughed loudly. She didn't think he would actually call, knowing she was married. He was either incredibly cocky or incredibly stupid, she thought as she pressed the answer button. "Davy, how are you?" Tracy replied in the sweetest tone. "Pretty good, Tracy. I was just sitting in my room thinking about today's game when you popped into my thoughts and I decided to call." "Are you at home or on the road?" Tracy asked, catching Davy off guard that she even knew about away games. From their conversation that evening, Davy got the impression that she knew little about sports and was even less interested in it. "We're in Birmingham, back home in a few days. I was hoping maybe we could meet for a quick dessert and drink on Thursday night if you're busy. You can bring your husband if you want. I'd like to meet the mayor. I've never officially met the mayor before. I think you two are quite a powerful couple." Tracy sensed a hint of sarcasm in Davy's voice. She knew he didn't want her husband to join, but she was impressed that Davy had the sense to play the game. Tracy was intrigued. "He has a council on Thursday night, but I'd love to join you, young man. Tracy responded, adding the ID as her way of playing the game. The two got to know each other better over glasses of amaretto di Serrano and slices of cheesecake. Tracy kept the conversation neutral, allowing Davy to choose the direction of the evening. He waited about 20 minutes before turning the discussion to a more intimate topic. "You're a beautiful woman. Does your husband mind that you sometimes meet men for drinks?" asked Davy. "Sometimes I date men, sometimes I date women. I have a diverse circle of friends. My husband knows that. He also knows he can trust me, even though he knows I'm a bit of a flirt." "Flirting a little?" Davy commented. "I'd take a little flirting. How far can that flirting go?" "How far would you like him to go?" Tracy answered. A slowly spreading smile appeared on Davy's face. He extended both hands across the table. Tracy put her hands in his. Evan McComb watched as a cute blonde hopped toward the checkout counter at Starbucks from a table in the back of the store. He noticed the light freckles on the bridge of her upturned nose and the light in her hazel eyes. He also noticed that her miniskirt barely reached the middle of her slender thighs. He knew that she visited this place regularly, and it took him about a month to work up the courage to finally talk to her. He stood up from his seat and paused at the door, waiting. As she approached, Evan made his move, introducing himself to her. At first, the young woman was surprised, but then reacted positively to Evan's introduction. She had seen him before in a cafe and was impressed by his good manners and the way he sat in his suits. The two returned to the table Evan had just left and talked for about 5 minutes before Jenna said she had to go back to work. Evan handed the young woman his phone so she could add her number to his contacts. Evan practically floated back to his job as an accountant. His colleagues noticed that the usually reserved accountant seemed optimistic as he moved around the office. Around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, his boss, Phil Cunningham, walked into Evan's office and asked if he had won the lottery. "I received the phone number for the future Mrs. Evan McComb this morning," Evan stated. Phil was Evan's boss for 2 years. The young man liked him, but had never seen him talk so positively about his relationship with a woman, especially when the two of them weren't even on a date. The next day, Evan called Jenna. They set up a dinner date at one of Evan's favorite seafood restaurants for the following Saturday night. Evan sighed out loud as Jenna opened the door to her apartment wearing her version of a little black dress. His quick glance revealed that she was not wearing a bra under the thin material, as her nipples were visibly erect and it went down just a couple of inches below her round butt. Evan thought she would have to be very careful when she sat down. "Does that sound like approval, or are you having an asthma attack?" Jenna suggested. "Definitely sounds like an endorsement. But now I'm worried because I didn't bring a baseball bat with me to fight off guys complimenting you." Jenna laughed, and Evan was pretty sure it was the most beautiful sound he'd ever heard. Dinner and conversation were wonderful. It was natural for Jenna to compare Evan to Davy throughout the evening. Although Davy won in most physical aspects, Jenna admitted that Evan was far from a troll, and she had to admit to herself that she seemed to click on many levels with him more than with Davy. However, she and Evan didn't discuss their other dates since it was their first date. They might have to discuss this issue sometime in the future, but for now they were both just enjoying each other's company. The evening ended with a modest kiss at Jenna's door. The next evening did not end with a modest kiss at Jenna's door. Jenna and Davy shared a deep, passionate kiss, and then moved inside for a long night of carnival of passion. Evan was far from her thoughts. Tracy was pleased with the way her relationship with the young athlete was going. He turned out to be more educated and well-read than she expected, and they enjoyed one trip to a nearby museum and another to the opening of an art exhibition. The couple ran into several of Tracy and her husband's friends at an art exhibition, and Davy was surprised at how at ease Tracy seemed to be seen in public with him. Although Tracy seemed as conservative as her husband, she knew that in another time and place she might have been a more happy-go-lucky woman. The only outward recognition of this was her tendency to flirt and a small tattoo on her left wrist, which was usually hidden under several bracelets. None of Tracy's friends seemed concerned or surprised by her interaction with the young athlete, although it raised some eyebrows among her friends' husbands. Almost all of her friends knew that Tracy was a known flirt, but it seemed a little too much for their men. Several of these men wondered how much her husband, the mayor, knew about her latest hobby. In fact, Mayor Richard Strickland knew very little about his wife's latest activities. Despite her flirtatious tendencies, which sometimes went too far for his liking, he always trusted his wife to know where to draw the line. Tracy was the well-settled wife of a successful lawyer for the first 11 years of their marriage, before the lawyer decided a little over 2 years ago that he needed to become mayor of the small town in which they lived. At 41, Richard was 6 years older than his wife, but like her, he looked younger. His short brown hair did not show the slightest sign of gray, and regular visits to the gym gave him a toned and somewhat muscular physique. Most agreed that he was a handsome man, although not as beautiful as his beautiful wife. In the autumn elections, it was not too difficult. Richard received about 2/3 of the votes. Most of his constituents seemed confident that he would bring the same strong work ethic to City Hall that he brought to his career as an attorney. Like most mayors, Richard attended a lot of meetings and probably didn't spend as much time on his job as he did when he started his law firm career. Some of his friends wondered if he was spending too much time being mayor at the expense of his marriage, especially when they saw Tracy with Davy. Tracy was the executive director of a non-profit organization in the city. The job only took about 30 hours a week, giving her flexibility for a social life and the ability to remain a visible figure in the community. It was not uncommon for Tracy to spend several lunches a week in the company of some of the community's more influential business leaders. In recent weeks, Tracy and Davy have started sharing little kisses in public. Tracy noted that in some companies this was hardly surprising. She began to touch Davy a little more freely, touching his arms and chest. She knew it was only a matter of time before Davy became her first lover. Although she admitted to herself that it was wrong, her growing attraction to the young man was drowned out by her guilt. Even though she truly loved her husband deep down, her lustful feelings made her think that this was what she was supposed to do. Jenna didn't feel any guilt as she lay in Evan's arms after the couple had just had sex. Jenna smiled to herself as she had just had great sex with 2 different men on 2 consecutive days. Neither man discussed exclusivity, and Jenna was going to enjoy what both men had to offer until a decision needed to be made. Mayor Richard Strickland and 3 other men sat in a darkened corner of the city's only high-end Hungarian restaurant. They were discussing financing details for a distribution center that was in talks to come to the city. The distribution center could bring several hundred jobs and tax revenue to the city. He needed to focus on the meeting. However, his attention was diverted a little when he saw his wife, accompanied by the star of the city's AA baseball team, Davy Boyd, enter the restaurant, and they were seated at a table on the other side of the establishment. "Wow, he's a handsome big guy," the mayor thought to himself. "She's getting a little bolder these days." He took another 5 seconds to think about what he had seen, then turned his attention back to the meeting. What Mayor Strickland didn't see was Tracy wearing the tight black miniskirt she had bought especially for Davy. She was clearly braless under her silky black blouse. Davy was more animated than Tracy had ever seen him before. He was the hero of the day, with 2 home runs, 3 hits, and 3 runs scored, he told Tracy. She had no idea what the handsome young man was talking about, but she knew it was something good based on his smile and the light in his eyes. She knew that tonight she would take their relationship to the next level. Davy calmed down over the course of dinner, and Tracy watched his transformation with quiet pride, feeling that she had a hand in shaping this young man's personality. "How about we take dessert to go?" Tracy suggested, smiling at him with her signature beautiful smile. "Richard won't be home until midnight. We have just under 3 hours to eat this dessert." "Oh, yes," exclaimed Davy enthusiastically. Tracy's miniskirt was removed within 15 seconds of her entering Davy's house. He looked with admiration at her elastic buttocks. He placed both hands on her buttocks and pulled her towards him for an open kiss. As they both lay there catching their breath, they both had pretty much the same thought. This was the best sex they'd ever had. Richard Strickland half walked, half staggered into his home at 12:30 at night, feeling like a winner. His presence and work just helped bring a distribution center to his town, creating a lot of jobs and tax revenue. The deal was sealed over a fine dinner and many drinks at the upscale Hungarian restaurant Magyar's. Now, as he slowly walked up the stairs, he remembered what he had briefly seen in the restaurant, his wife in the company of the star of the city's Doblia baseball team, Davy Boyd. As the executive director of one of the city's largest non-profit organizations, Tracy could have been dating the player for a variety of legitimate reasons, but if that was the case, his very organized wife would have told him in advance. He didn't remember any conversation in which she told him she was going to meet Boyd. Richard knew that his wife was a big flirt and had all the attributes to back it up, but he also trusted that her flirting was just that, and nothing more. Sometimes, during their 10 years of marriage, he had doubts, but every time he checked something, Tracy turned out to be innocent. He hoped it would be the same this time. Tracy was the smartest legal advisor Richard had ever hired at his law firm, Atterbury Salerno Strickland LLP. They started dating a year after she started working and got married a year after their relationship began. She left the law firm immediately after they began dating and began working for a non-profit a few months after their wedding. Richard was 31 years old when they married. Before meeting Tracy, he was in 2 long-term relationships. He was a handsome, successful lawyer, and finding women to date was never a problem. Tracy's flirtatious nature became a point of contention in their marriage from time to time. Her husband repeatedly told her that in their circles in the city society, her flirting was very disrespectful towards him. "Come on, Richie. You know, I don't mean anything serious, it's just my fun," Tracy said. "Please think about my feelings sometimes, Tracy," Richard replied. Richard undressed slowly in the darkness of the bedroom so as not to wake his wife. He slowly crawled under the covers and pressed himself against Tracy, first smelling her skin and then her hair. The smell of soap and shampoo was still strong, which meant she had showered a little earlier before bed. Since Tracy did not usually shower before bed, Richard knew that his wife was no longer his only. He turned it in bed so that his back was facing his wife. A tear rolled out of his eye as he fell asleep. "So who's your boyfriend now, girlfriend?" Sheila Williamson asked her longtime friend, Jenna Wyatt, as they finished lunch. Jenna blushed furiously, wondering if she should tell her friend the truth, that she was dating 2 guys at the same time. She wondered why she felt guilty about this, since neither man had discussed exclusivity. Perhaps because Sheila had known her long enough to know that, at 20, Jenna was far from a virgin. Sheila saw the deep redness and knew exactly what it meant. "So I guess it's not who, but how many," Sheila giggled. "Come on, lay it out." Jenna looked down at the floor before meeting her friend's gaze. She told her about Davy and Evan. "Wait, you're dating this piece of baseball meat? How's that?" Sheila asked. "He's all you see," Jenna replied. "He's big, he's got muscles, he's got money, he looks great, and he's great in bed. But this other guy, he makes me feel confused. Not as big, not as muscular, definitely not the same money. But he's also handsome and good in bed and, I don't know. There's something about him that excites me in a way that Davy can't. We can talk about anything, and he's just pleasant to talk to. And I miss him when I'm alone. I don't miss Davy as much when I'm alone. Does that make sense?" "That sounds suspiciously like love, darling," Sheila said. "You need to see if you can't keep him before he goes to someone else. A baseball player may be fun, but love is gold. Secure your claim to him quickly, Jenna." Jenna looked straight into her friend's eyes. She saw that Sheila was dead serious. "Sometimes when Davy calls, I know he just wants sex," Jenna admitted. "Evan wants to be with me. Sex is an addition." And here's your answer to that question, Jenna. Despite this conversation, Jenna didn't hesitate to say yes when Davy called and set up a date for 2 days later. He sent her a ticket to the game, and they were supposed to go together afterwards. Evan and his friend Scott Segura had good seats at Thursday's Wahoo game. When Davy Boyd hit a 2-run home run in the 6th inning, the stadium erupted in cheers. Evan, sitting about 5 rows from Wahoo first base, thought he heard a familiar voice amid the commotion. Sitting 3 rows ahead of him, in the row directly behind the bench where the players' families and friends sat, was Jenna. She was beautifully dressed, but seemed to be alone. Evan didn't say anything to his friend, but continued to watch Jenna over the next few innings. He noticed that Davy stood up and looked directly at the young blonde several times, and she seemed to wave in his direction once or twice. Evan wasn't born yesterday and knew what he was seeing. He was confused, but as he sat in the stands and thought about it, he realized that neither he nor Jenna had ever made a promise to be exclusive. He realized that this was something he needed to fix if she wasn't already in a relationship with the baseball player. Evan pointed Jenna out to his friend and told him their story so far. When the game ended, the 2 men secretly watched the young woman. When Davy left the stadium, Jenna practically jumped into his strong arms, and they drove off in Davy's brand-new Porsche. Tracy didn't even notice the inconspicuous black sedan that followed her into the parking lot of the Italian restaurant. The driver of that car parked close enough to photograph her and see her enter the restaurant minutes before Davy entered. He opened Clive Cussler's thick book, knowing he had at least an hour to read. Dinner took the couple a little longer that night. They left the restaurant holding hands, and then each got into their own car and drove to Davy's house. The sedan followed both cars at a safe distance. The driver took a photo of Tracy as she passed his car, her hair tousled and her makeup washed off. He then drove to Mayor Richard Strickland's office and waited until the council meeting ended before entering the mayor's office. Mark Garton, a private investigator, waited until the mayor was completely alone before knocking on his door. The mayor recognized the man as he entered the office. His bedroom is on the 2nd floor, so I wasn't able to get actual photos of them being there together. But judging by the way it looked before and after entering the player's house, only an idiot or a Puritan would think they didn't have sex. And based on what you told me about her later souls, well, that's clear in my opinion. "Thank you, Mr. Garton," said Mayor Strickland, handing the detective a check for his services. After the detective left, the mayor dropped his head into his hands and cried like a child. Breakfast at the Strickland house the next morning was quiet, although Tracy was clearly in a good mood, humming as she moved around the kitchen. Richard looked depressed as he sat at the kitchen table. "You don't look too good, darling. We have Alka-Seltzer in the bathroom if your stomach is upset," Tracy said. "I have a gun in my gun safe that would make me feel better too," the mayor thought to himself. Tracy saw no signs that her husband suspected anything about her actions. She always considered herself smarter than her husband, forgetting that his more passive behavior did not reflect his intelligence. Tracy believed that she truly loved her husband, but at the same time she believed that she deserved her romance with the young baseball player. Her husband was perfectly acceptable in bed, in her opinion, but Davy was at least 2 notches above, and she deserved it. She knew what she was doing was technically wrong, but it was so good that she didn't feel guilty. She knew it was a cliché, but her affair was really just for the great sex. When this is over, she will return to the role of a loving, caring wife. Richard watched his wife whistling merrily as she moved around the kitchen with growing anger. He noticed that he and Tracy had not been intimate for about a month. Before this, they had sex 2 to 3 times a week, and Richard didn't think they had any problems in that regard. As in many families, the wife dictated the agenda at home. The couple didn't have serious conversations about children before they got married, but about 2 years. After their marriage, Tracy decided she didn't want children. She and Richard had some heated discussions on the matter, but in the end, Tracy got her way and Richard had a vasectomy. Between work and dating 2 men at the same time, Jenna didn't notice that Evan hadn't called her for a week. The next week, halfway through sex with Davy, Jenna suddenly realized that she hadn't heard a word from her other suitor. When Jenna got home, it was too late to call Evan, but she called him the next day, during her lunch break. This was the first time she had to call the young accountant. "Did I do something wrong, Evan?" Jenna asked when Evan answered the 3rd call. Evan carefully weighed what he considered his 2 options: tell Jenna what he knew about her dating Davy, or simply let the relationship end. There was silence on the line for about 10 seconds. "Jenna, I know you're dating both a baseball star and me." I know we never talked about exclusivity, but I can't deal with you dating, and I'm sure sleeping, with two guys at the same time. I know I don't have his money and I'm not a big tough guy, but I want to be the only one in your life. I want to find out if we have something more." Jenna's eyes widened on her end of the phone call, even though Evan couldn't see them. She stuttered for a second before answering yes. "How about we celebrate our new beginning this Saturday night?" Evan said. This time, Jenna didn't stutter, but quickly shouted, "Yes! Yes! Yes!" A few days later, Davy called Jenna asking for a date. She politely refused him, saying that she was now dating another man on exclusive terms. "Well, that's great for you, but it shouldn't concern us, should it?" Davy asked. "I mean, we weren't looking for Brad and Angelina. We were just having fun. Can't this go on while you're dating this guy?" "Sorry, Davy. Evan isn't that kind of guy," Jenna said. "And I won't cheat when I make a commitment. I had a great time with you, but this is probably the end." "Okay, but if you ever change your mind, you have my number." "Love you, Davy. I hope you have a great career." Sam Casper had the honor of informing Davy of his call-up to the Miami Marlins in September. He arrived at Fetterman Stadium minutes before kickoff one late August day. "Hey, Bubba, my name is Opportunity and I'm knocking," Sam said as he approached Davy in the Wahoo's locker room. "Seriously, Mr. K?" Davy said with great enthusiasm. The older man smiled and nodded. "Hell yes, I will answer," cried Davy as his teammates gathered around congratulating him. Davy's promotion became news the next day. Richard Strickland read the story in the newspaper with interest. He still loved his wife, but was unsure of his next steps. He called his former law firm partner, Rick Salerno. A week after Davy was called, Tracy's hormones were raging. She had been having sex with the baseball player 2 or 3 times a week for the past 6 weeks, and the sudden cessation of sex had an effect on her. She heard her husband in his office and realized that it had been quite some time since they last had sex. She tried to remember the last time and came to the conclusion that she and Richard had not been intimate since she started having sex with Davy. She and Richard used to have a wild sex life, Tracy recalled. When did it disappear? When was the last time they even hugged? Has she really gotten that far away? For the first time since the beginning of the novel, Tracy felt guilty. In Miami, Davy also missed the regular sex he had with Tracy and Jenna. Pitchers in the majors were doing whatever they wanted with the young player, and he had yet to go to places where he could meet women. "Hey, baby, maybe you can go away for a couple of days this week? I really miss what we had," Davy said as Tracy answered the phone. "Oh, God, Davy, I miss you so much," Tracy almost exclaimed. "Tell me when, and I'll be there." That evening, when Richard returned home, Tracy told him that she and Alyssa were going to spend a few days shopping in Miami, if he didn't mind. This was a typical request that Tracy had made, and Richard had approved over the years. This time, however, Richard had not expected this request, and did his best to hide his surprise. Was she so desperate that she was willing to assume that her husband suspected absolutely nothing? Or was it more than just sex? How much of a betrayal? Richard wondered. Richard tried to hide the deep breath he needed to take, then agreed. Tracy had just given him the final answer, he thought. Tracy took a taxi from the airport to the apartment Davy was renting. She threw herself into the young man's arms and kissed him on the lips as soon as he opened the door. He kissed her back for about 30 seconds, then gently set her down. "Oh, I want you so bad right now, but I have to go to a baseball game. It's the big leagues, baby. We'll have dinner when I get back. I'm so glad you're here. You won't regret coming," exclaimed Davy. Tracy felt more energetic and alive than she had since Davy first left. She opened her suitcase and pulled out a sexy red baby doll and matching panties. Perhaps it was the thought of Tracy waiting for him at home, or perhaps it was just the first of many great nights. But Davy had 2 hits, including his first home run in the big leagues, and scored 3 runs. He grabbed Chinese food on the way home and practically threw open his apartment door when he arrived home. Tracy was stretched out on his couch, one leg bent, drinking a glass of wine. He placed the bag of Chinese food on the kitchen table, and that's where it remained for the next 2 hours before a tired and sweaty Davy and Tracy finally reached it. Around the same time that Davy and Tracy settled into Davy's shower the next morning, Richard was considering his divorce petition. It was a simple split down the middle, but Richard was only going to pay 5 years of alimony, as long as Tracy paid her own rent and Davy didn't live with her. Richard knew it seemed childish, but it may have been the only victory he could get in court. Evan was practically delighted when he learned of Davy's promotion to the first team for September. He had completely trusted Jenna when she promised to be with him exclusively, but it was still a big relief that Davy wasn't living in town anymore. On her part, Jenna understood that Davy's promotion was good news for him, but since she had promised to be with Evan, she didn't care that Davy was no longer in town. Davy and Tracy spent most of their 3 days together, having sex and visiting several high-end restaurants in Miami when Davy wasn't playing baseball. Davy noticed that Tracy's skirts and dresses seemed a little shorter than what she had worn in Pensacola, and he thought they made a striking couple together. Tracy felt the eyes of other restaurant patrons on her, some because she was with Davy and some because she knew she looked sexy. She had to admit that life in Miami seemed much sexier than life in Pensacola. Tracy felt relaxed as the taxi pulled up in front of her darkened home. She hoped she wouldn't have to talk much to her husband until the next morning. She had showered earlier in the day before boarding the plane, so at least she didn't come home smelling like sex. Richard sat in the darkened living room with a full glass of bourbon, watching as a taxi passenger collected his bag from the driver in the driveway. He saw her walk up the 2 steps to the front door of the house, hesitate for a moment, then insert the key into the lock and enter the house, unaware that her husband was watching her closely. Had to tune in to your boring old husband after 3 days of sex with your millionaire baseball player? Richard asked, firmly but quietly. Tracy started, not realizing that someone was home in the darkened room. I, Tracy stuttered, unable to form any coherent sentences. Jumping back a foot, she remained where she was, barely able to see her husband in the darkness. I know exactly what you're thinking, he continued. How did your stupid, unsuspecting, cuckolded husband find out about your trip? Or your lover in the first place? Richard drank while Tracy watched him in the dark. Although she and many others thought she was smarter than her husband, she was completely taken by surprise and left speechless. Don't worry, Alyssa didn't give you away, Richard said sarcastically. I knew you were going alone, but to confirm, I called her house. When Glenn answered the phone, I asked to speak to Alyssa, and he almost fell through the floor, trying not to lie to me, but trying to tell me that she wasn't there. That's the problem when you use a woman with a good and honest husband as a cover. I asked him not to tell Alyssa that I called so she wouldn't have time to warn you. He felt obligated to keep my secret. Tracy let out a small sigh. Since she didn't know exactly how much Richard knew, any possible defensive words she might have would have been imprudent. In this case, silence was her best choice, Tracy realized. Richard knew it too, but the longer she stood there silently, the angrier he became. When did you stop respecting me? When did you stop loving me? Richard hissed. I never stopped loving you, Richard. It has nothing to do with love. Well, maybe a little, if I'm being honest. Wow, honesty. What a fantastic concept, Richard shouted at his wife. Richard took another sip of bourbon. Tracy put down her bag and sat down on the chair. Can I turn on the light? I'd like to see you when I talk to you, Tracy said. No, you just want to see my eyes to see if I believe any of your lies, Richard answered her sharply. Be careful. I know most of your tricks at this stage. The only thing I haven't figured out yet is why. I don't know if I can give you an answer to that, Tracy said. Richie, you know, I'm a big flirt. We used to argue about this. You were always afraid that I would cross that line, and I always swore that I would never do it. But I was wrong. Something about him hooked me, Richie. I can't explain it. He was sexy and sweet and had I don't know what about him. And the sex was so good. And when we started seeing each other regularly, I learned that he was more than just a baseball player. He has brains in addition to his brawn and talent. I guess I'm a little into him and fell in love. More than a little, Tracy, sighed Richard. And at the same time, you and I haven't even had sex in like 3 months. You don't need me anymore. And you can't keep your hands off that damn boy. And then there was this weekend. Did you even go to the game this weekend? Or was it all just about sex? Do you really have to be so rude to me, Richard? Tracy said, trying to remember in her head the last time a couple actually had sex. She looked up to see Richard looking at her piercingly. I was never rude to you when you were my wife, but now that you're his, all bets are off, Richard said. I'm still your wife, Richard. We need to talk and work things out, Tracy said. No, we don't need to talk, said Richard. I already understood everything. I was thinking while you were having fun. Really, Richie? Go away, Tracy. Tracy rolled her eyes and pursed her lips, but this time she remained silent. So do you understand, Richard? What do you see happening next? Well, tomorrow you'll be served with divorce papers. You sign them, and in 30 days or so you can go to your boy forever, and I'll get a piece of my self-respect back. That's not how I see it, Richard. I'm sure we can fix it. Yes, I made a mistake, but there's no reason to go to extremes. Let's slow down and rethink this. We've got a communication breakdown here, Richard said, imitating Strother Martin's famous line from the movie Cool Hand Luke. Tracy looked at Richard in surprise. Polite, quiet, stable, Richard seemed to take the possible divorce somewhat humorously. What is going on here? She asked herself. Richard moved his belongings into the couple's guest room. He went upstairs, entered the room, and locked the door. Tracy sat downstairs, her brain working at full capacity. She never considered the possibility of getting caught and what the consequences might be. As Richard had warned her, Tracy was served on Monday morning. Even though Richard had warned her, she was almost sure that he would call it off. The fact that he went ahead with the presentation made Tracy more than a little nervous. The events of the last 2 days had truly shown Tracy a side of Richard that she had never seen before. Richard focused heavily on his duties as mayor over the next few days as a way to cope with the situation. However, it wasn't that difficult because he really enjoyed being the mayor of the city. Tracy was coping significantly worse with what was happening in her life. She spent the rest of Monday in a sort of daze, and things didn't get any better in the days that followed. Davy called her around noon on Thursday. Hi, beautiful. How are you? Do you miss me? He asked. Tracy's heart began to beat faster when she heard Davy's voice for the first time. Then reality invaded her thoughts. Richard knows about us and has known for a long time, she replied in an even tone. He also knows about our weekend adventure. I was served on Monday. Richard, how's your husband? Davy asked, almost rhetorically. He paused on the line as his thoughts began to race. Since he knows, why don't you just come back here and stay with me full time? Davy said. We'll be back in Pensacola in a few weeks anyway, at least for the winter. Then we'll either find a spot in Miami or Jacksonville, depending on where I play next season. This time, Tracy was silent. This is so right, she finally said enthusiastically. How about I go back to Miami on Saturday? Great, baby. I can't wait to see you. Just send me the details. Tracy put the phone away and sat in silence. Within a minute, she admitted to herself that while she might love her husband, her feelings for Davy had grown so much that she was willing to leave Richard for the young baseball player. I'm sorry, Richard, she whispered to herself. Richard didn't come home for dinner on Thursday night, but Tracy was sitting in the darkened living room with a glass of wine when he walked through the door around 9 p.m. She thought the situation was very ironic and smiled to herself when he flinched at her greeting as he walked through the door. Hey, Tracy, Richard stuttered, instantly realizing that he was being set up for something. Let me grab myself a beer and we can talk. Tracy had to admit that her ploy didn't seem to put Richard in the predicament she thought it would be. Richard returned to the room with the beer less than a minute later and gave her a wry smile as he sat down in his chair. Over, Tracy, he chuckled. Tracy found that Richard's self-confidence somehow unnerved her. She started looking at the floor, then realized that her husband was watching her closely in the dark. I'm going back to Miami for a few weeks to stay with Davy. We'll be back in October." "That should give you time to think," Tracy said. "Are you out of your mind?" exclaimed Richard. "You're telling me you don't want a divorce, but you're going back to this guy for a few weeks. I won't be a known cuckold to anyone. If you leave, you better stay away forever." Richard jumped out of his chair, poured his beer into the sink, and stepped into the guest room. Tracy grinned after him, truly believing that she had regained control. Tracy enjoyed time with Davy when the Marlins played at home. Otherwise, she felt lonely when the Marlins were away. Davy spent time with young players, all of whom had young wives or girlfriends, and Tracy did not find common ground with them. She also didn't find much in common with the wives and girlfriends of older players who knew much about baseball. What I couldn't say about myself. Davy and Tracy returned to Pensacola when the Major League Baseball season ended in early October. The couple returned to Davy's rented house, but after a few days, Tracy decided it was finally time to confront Richard. She knew that Richard would never take her back at this stage, but she came to her former home to pick up the remaining belongings and clothes. Tracy was surprised when her key no longer worked in any of the doors in the house. She was surprised that Richard had thought about changing the locks. She had to ring the front doorbell. "The prodigal wife has returned," said Richard, opening the door. "Are we going to do this now?" asked Tracy. "Absolutely," Richard said, smiling widely. Tracy told Richard that she had come to get the remaining things and clothes. Richard took her to the garage, where a series of garbage bags were waiting for her. He opened the garage door and told her to load them herself. She snorted in disgust. Richard chuckled and walked away. After 2 weeks, Tracy was sure she had missed her period. She recalled that when she first arrived in Miami, Davy didn't think to buy condoms, and yet the couple still had sex twice that first night before Davy bought a dozen the next day. Davy fell silent when Tracy told him the news. "We can handle this. I'm sure the team doctors know who the best doctors are to handle this safely," Davy finally said. Tracy began to cry quietly. "I can't do this," she said. "I could never do that." "It's okay, baby. I've always wanted a lot of kids. Maybe not this early, but I love kids, and I've always wanted a lot of them." "I didn't mean to," Tracy said quietly. Tracy was 4 months pregnant when she and Richard signed divorce papers. He hadn't seen her since she went to live with Davy and didn't know she was pregnant. His face showed shock when he first saw her. "New respect for your lover, Tracy. You never wanted children with me, but he must be so much more of a man." "Well, I certainly can't say you were reckless, can I?" Tracy blushed, but didn't say anything. Richard's lawyer quickly pointed out to everyone present that Richard's name on the birth certificate would be considered a lie under oath. "Davy knows it's his baby and has already promised to pay for the birth and child support," Tracy said quietly. Davy was promoted to AAA Jacksonville for the following season. Since Tracy would be 7 months pregnant at the start of the AAA season, they decided she should stay in Pensacola until the baby was born. Davy rented himself a small apartment in Jacksonville in case he couldn't get home between games when the team played at home. June 27th was a bright and sunny day in Pensacola. Tracy went into labor around noon. As planned, she called her friend Alyssa to take her to Baptist Hospital. On the way to the hospital, she called Davy, and he told his manager, and got into the car for the roughly 5-hour drive. At 10:47 p.m., Evan and Jenna McComb welcomed their daughter after 6 hours of labor. Evan, now an associate vice president at the accounting firm where he worked, had the opportunity to cut the umbilical cord and felt like he was on cloud 9. Dr. Leslie Scott congratulated the couple, but could not stay because she had another birth to attend. She walked out of the delivery room and down the hallway where baseball phenom Davy Boyd and his girlfriend Tracy Strickland were preparing for the birth of their first child. Dr. Scott fell in love with a young baseball player and his older girlfriend. Although the couple were not married, she noted that the young athlete was very caring for the older woman, who tolerated her first pregnancy well, despite her 36 years. Dr. Scott, while noting that a first child for a 36-year-old woman is not that uncommon, also noted that the risks for a 30-year-old woman are higher than for a 20-year-old woman. Tracy carefully monitored her weight, gaining only 27 pounds during her pregnancy. The doctor also noted that the baseball player seemed much more enthusiastic about the pregnancy than his girlfriend. Tracy admitted to the doctor at one appointment when they were alone that she forced her soon-to-be ex-husband to have a vasectomy because she didn't want children. The pregnancy resulted from a moment of passion that eluded Davy and Tracy when they didn't have condoms. Not many couples have experienced this, the doctor thought to herself. While Tracy and the boy remained in Pensacola, Davy returned to work in Jacksonville. 2 weeks later, he was sitting in a quiet restaurant with an older woman when an angry man approached the couple. "Who's your friend, Cassie? Does he know you're married? How many times have you had sex already?" he shouted to the couple. The restaurant became quiet. Davy looked at Cassie, and she looked at him. Cassie stuttered several times before Davy slid out from behind the table and stood face to face with a man who seemed several inches smaller and lighter. When police and paramedics arrived at the restaurant, Davy was lying on the floor, bleeding from several cuts on his face. His right eye was closed and beginning to turn blue. Harrison Walker, a construction worker and husband of Cassie Walker, had cuts and bruises on the knuckles of his left hand. His wife was still sitting at the table, sobbing. Davy was still in the hospital when the report of the incident at the restaurant made the news. It goes without saying that Marlins management was not happy about one of their high-priced investments suffering a potentially career-threatening eye injury. Also not thrilled when she heard the news was Tracy, especially when she learned the story that Davy was at a restaurant with a married woman. The coincidence did not deceive her. "Damn it!" Tracy shouted to no one. The noise woke up her baby, who began to cry. No stupid act goes unpunished, the woman thought. Being only human, Richard Strickland couldn't help but smile when he heard about Davy's beating. He also didn't feel an ounce of sympathy for his ex-wife and her predicament. She made a bad choice, he thought to himself, slightly changing the memorable line from the movie Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. Pensacola police declined to charge Harrison Walker, especially after witnesses said the baseball player was the one who started the fight. Richard Strickland tasked one of his employees with finding Harrison's cell phone number, and the mayor called the construction worker, offering him the name and phone number of his divorce lawyer. He also offered his sincere congratulations to the young man for defeating the baseball player. 2 weeks later, Tracy and the baby, whom the couple named Frederick after Davy's favorite player, Freddie Freeman, of the Atlanta Braves, moved into a smaller apartment that Tracy rented. Tracy has instructed her attorney to contact Davy to establish child support payments and visitation rights. She was still receiving alimony from Richard. As fall turned to winter, Marlins management became seriously concerned that the blurry vision in Davy's right eye was not going away. Insurance will cover the contract, but nothing can compensate for the player's potential. Hits, home runs, runs scored. Life as a single stay-at-home mom took its toll on Tracy both mentally and physically. She seemed to have lost a significant number of friends since her divorce from Richard, and the few friends who remained did not seem interested in spending time with a 30-year-old woman with a child. She only lost half her postpartum weight before leaving Davy and gained about 15 pounds in the 14 months she was alone. Her chic wardrobe was pushed to the back of her closet and drawers, replaced by mom jeans and oversized sweaters. Her hair had grown longer, and most days she simply wore it in a ponytail. The city's two-term mayor was standing on a quad in downtown Pensacola, watching an older woman push a stroller through an intersection when she twisted her ankle and fell to the ground. Being the gentleman that he was, Richard Strickland turned on his hazard lights, got out of the car, and walked over to help the woman. He thought she looked familiar when he approached her, and when he helped her up, he was convinced of it. "Hi, Tracy. Long time no see, huh?" Richard said quietly, looking into her face. From the shock of the fall, Tracy did not recognize the person who came to her aid. The voice gave him away, forcing her to look more closely at her well-wisher. He looked like an older version of her ex-husband. Gray hair had already touched his hair, wrinkles appeared on his forehead and around his eyes. His eyes weren't shining as brightly anymore. They had an empty look to them, despite the small smile he gave her. "Thanks for your help, Richard. I guess I've gotten clumsy as I've gotten older," Tracy replied. "If you are old, then what can we say about me? After all, I am 5 years older than you. Let me park the car and I'll give you and the baby a ride home." Tracy waited while Richard parked his car. When he approached again, Tracy told him that she was well enough to walk home on her own, but if he had time, she wouldn't mind sitting down with him for a cup of coffee at the coffee shop half a block away. Richard thought her eyes looked more like a request than a question, and nodded in agreement. Tracy pushed the stroller in front of them as they walked the half block to the coffee shop. Richard's brain was working at full capacity as they walked. He looked at the child's face, sadly thinking that, in another life, this could have been their child. He shook his head to clear the thought, and Tracy gave him a quick side glance as he did so. Having rid himself of this thought, at least for a while, Richard could not believe that the woman he was walking with was his ex-wife. Although only 3 years had passed since the divorce, Tracy seemed 20 years older during that time. When he first saw her, Richard thought she was the grandmother of a child, perhaps aged 50, 55. She only slightly resembles Tracy, who had once been his wife. Richard ordered coffee for himself, a salted caramel latte for Tracy, and warm milk for the baby. He had to admit to himself that the child was beautiful, a good combination of both his mother and father. "You remember." "How sweet," Tracy said, as she tasted her latte. Richard blushed slightly. He simply ordered without thinking. It was a reflex. "How are you doing, Tracy? If I'm not too intrusive, are you seeing anyone?" Tracy knew Richard wasn't trying to be intrusive. He was what he always was, a good guy. "I haven't dated anyone since I broke up with Davy," Tracy said quietly. "It was a big shock to me. I guess karma really is a bitch, but it gave me a chance to feel what I gave you. Yes, it hurts. I guess it must give you some sense of revenge." Tracy's voice died down. Tears appeared in her eyes. Richard sat silently. Once upon a time, he might have enjoyed her sad news, but after 3 years, his anger faded. Sadness replaced the desire for revenge in his heart. "I'm sorry to hear that, Tracy. Really, I mean it. I don't hate you anymore. I think, if anything, I feel sorry for myself. And you, for what we lost. And what could have would be. Still not sure why." "It took me a long time to fully understand this, Richard," Tracy admitted. "I kinda lost myself for a while. I think I saw it as a way to satisfy my secret fantasy of being a bad girl. I felt like I deserved it and could keep you in the dark when in fact I didn't hide it that much. I thought I could have the best of both worlds. And with my stupidity, I hurt a good man and threw him away. I'm sorry, Richard. I mean it sincerely." "Well, look at it this way, Tracy. Something good did come out of it all. He's a great kid, and at least you'll have him around, enjoying him growing up." Tracy looked very guilty after that last statement. "I know you didn't want kids, Tracy, but it happened. When God gives you lemons, make the best of it, and never let him know he wasn't wanted. You have a great capacity for love. I know that firsthand." Tracy began to cry quietly. After a moment, Richard handed her his handkerchief from his pocket. Of course, Tracy thought to herself. "What about you, Richard? Is there someone in your life now? Please tell me I haven't ruined your attitude towards all women." "There's no one right now, Tracy, but I'm an optimist by nature. You know that," Richard said. "I'm probably still a little scared of commitment, but one day I'll get back on track." Tracy lowered her eyes to the table so Richard wouldn't see how guilty she felt. Richard felt uneasy. It was time to leave. He stood up to leave, but Tracy put her hand on his to stop him. Richard took the hint from his years together with Tracy in the past and sat back down. "Richard, what are the chances? I mean, you're lonely, I'm lonely. I know I messed it up once with the best man a woman could ask for, but I wouldn't have made the same mistake if you had given me a second chance. I can promise you that." Tracy raised her eyes and looked straight at Richard. He had a 1,000-mile stare into the distance for 5, maybe 10 seconds before he showed any emotion, finally frowning. "God, I loved you so much," Richard whispered, causing Tracy to lean closer to him. I so wanted to believe that you were just flirting with him when I saw you together in that restaurant. I always knew that I was not the god of the Greeks, but I really believed that you loved me, maybe even loved me the same way. As much as I do you. I gave up the chance to have kids. I really wanted kids. You knew that, but I gave it up because I loved you. Then you betrayed my love, betrayed my trust, and you topped it off by having a baby with that damn baseball player. I may not be angry anymore, but to forgive and forget? Not in this life, baby. Richard stood up, stroked the child's hair, and left. Subscribe to our channel so that your second chaff doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think about listening to the next one.